The year is 409 AD. The Roman Empire, the greatest civilization the world has ever known, is dying. Not with a dramatic final battle, but through a slow, agonizing decay that has been spreading for decades. And nowhere is this collapse more visible than in Hispania, the wealthy, fertile peninsula that Rome had controlled for over 6 centuries. The legions are gone, the administrators have fled, the roads that once carried Roman commerce now carry something else entirely: Germanic warriors, tens of thousands of them, pouring through the Pyrenean passes like water through a broken dam. The Vandals came first, then the Alans, then the Suebi, 3 distinct peoples, each with their own kings, their own warriors, their own ambitions. They didn't arrive as conquerors seeking to destroy Rome. They arrived as migrants seeking land, safety, and a future. The distinction matters because it explains everything that followed. The Vandals claimed the southern regions. The very name Andalusia derives from Vandalusia, the land of the Vandals. The Suebi settled in the northwest, in the green, rainy territories of Galatia. The Alans took the central plateau, though their presence would prove far less enduring than their Germanic cousins. Within a decade, Roman Hispania had become a patchwork of competing authorities. In some cities, Roman administrators still collected taxes and maintained the courts. In others, Germanic chieftains ruled according to their own customs. The transition wasn't clean or orderly. It was messy, violent, and deeply traumatic for the millions of Hispano-Romans who watched their world dissolve. Then came the Visigoths. The Visigoths were different from the earlier Germanic settlers. In one crucial respect, they entered Hispania as foederati, allied troops officially sanctioned by Rome to act on behalf of imperial interests. Their mandate was to restore order by subduing the other Germanic tribes, and they pursued this task with devastating effectiveness. Under King Wallia, the Visigoths systematically crushed the Vandals and Alans. The Vandals were driven toward North Africa, where they would eventually establish their own kingdom and sack Rome itself in 455. The Alans were virtually eliminated as a political force, their survivors absorbed into other populations. Only the Suebi in their northwestern stronghold managed to maintain independence, protected by the rugged terrain of Galicia. The Visigothic settlement process was remarkably sophisticated for a supposedly barbarian people. Rather than simply seizing territory through conquest, they implemented a system called hospitalitas, hospitality. Under this arrangement, Visigothic warriors received portions of Roman estates, typically 1/3 of the productive land, while Roman proprietors retained the remainder. This system, known as the tertia, created a framework for coexistence that would persist for generations. Gothic warriors became landowners with vested interests in maintaining agricultural productivity. Roman aristocrats retained enough wealth to preserve their social status and cultural traditions. The two populations lived side by side, gradually intermarrying and blending their customs. The establishment of Toledo, as the Visigothic capital around 550, marked a crucial turning point. The city's central location provided strategic advantages for controlling the entire peninsula, while its existing Roman infrastructure offered the administrative capabilities necessary for governing a complex, ethnically diverse population. The royal palace complex that emerged in Toledo became the seat of a sophisticated court culture. Germanic traditions of warrior kingship blended with Roman administrative practices and increasingly influential Christian religious elements. The result was something new, neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but a distinctive Visigothic synthesis. Visigothic kingship operated according to elective rather than hereditary principles. The nobility possessed the right to select rulers from among qualified candidates, typically members of prominent Gothic families who had demonstrated military prowess and political acumen. This system theoretically ensured that only capable leaders would ascend to the throne. In practice, it generated constant competition and intrigue. Ambitious nobles formed factions, plotted assassinations, and launched rebellions. Of the 33 Visigothic kings who ruled between 418 and 711, at least 15 were murdered, deposed, or died in civil war. The elective monarchy that was supposed to guarantee competent leadership became a source of chronic instability. The religious transformation of the Visigothic kingdom represented one of the most significant developments of the 6th century. The Visigoths had originally embraced Arian Christianity, a theological position that denied the full divinity of Christ and had been condemned as heretical by the Roman Catholic Church. This religious divide created persistent tensions. The Visigothic ruling class was Arian. Their Hispano-Roman subjects were overwhelmingly Catholic. The two communities worshipped in separate churches, followed different religious calendars, and viewed each other with mutual suspicion. This division undermined the kingdom's internal cohesion and complicated relationships with other Christian powers. King Richard's conversion to Catholicism in 587 changed everything. The conversion wasn't merely a personal decision, it was a calculated political move designed to unite his diverse subjects under a common religious framework. The Third Council of Toledo in 589 formally ratified this transformation, with Richard publicly renouncing Arianism and embracing Catholic orthodoxy alongside numerous Visigothic nobles and bishops. The political implications extended far beyond theology. Catholic Christianity provided a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic divisions between Goths and Romans. The conversion eliminated a major source of internal dissent, as Catholic Romans could no longer view their Visigothic rulers as religious outsiders imposing an alien faith. The integration of Catholic Christianity into Visigothic governance manifested most clearly in the institution of church councils. These assemblies, which met regularly in Toledo, combined ecclesiastical and secular authority in unprecedented ways. Bishops and nobles deliberated together on matters ranging from theological doctrine to civil legislation, creating a unique form of government that historians have termed conciliar monarchy. The council's decisions carried the force of royal law. Their proceedings were recorded in detailed acta that provide invaluable insights into Visigothic political culture. Through these councils, the church became an integral part of the state apparatus, legitimizing royal authority while gaining influence over secular affairs. The development of Visigothic legal traditions represented another crucial aspect of the kingdom's institutional evolution. The earliest Germanic law codes had been primarily oral traditions governing relationships within tribal communities. But the complexities of ruling a large, diverse kingdom demanded more sophisticated legal instruments. The Codex Euritianus, promulgated around 475 under King Euric, represented the first systematic attempt to codify Visigothic law in written form. This early code addressed fundamental questions about the relationship between Gothic and Roman legal traditions. Rather than simply imposing Germanic customs on Roman subjects, the Visigoths developed a dual legal system that allowed different ethnic groups to be governed according to their ancestral laws. Goths were subject to Germanic legal principles, emphasizing personal honor and collective responsibility. Romans continued to be governed by modified versions of Roman civil law. This arrangement acknowledged the reality of a divided society while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes across ethnic boundaries. The limitations of this dual system became increasingly apparent as intermarriage and cultural assimilation blurred ethnic boundaries. The distinction between Goth and Roman grew less meaningful with each generation, creating confusion about which legal principles should apply in specific cases. King Chindaswinth began addressing these problems in the mid-7th century by commissioning a comprehensive revision of the kingdom's legal framework. The resulting Liber Judiciorum, completed under King Regiswinth around 654, represented one of the most sophisticated legal achievements of early medieval Europe. This comprehensive code abandoned the ethnic distinctions of earlier legislation, establishing a unified legal system that applied equally to all subjects regardless of their ancestral origins. The code's 12 books addressed everything from constitutional principles and criminal law to commercial regulations and family relationships. The Liber Judiciorum's influence extended far beyond the Visigothic kingdom's political boundaries. Its systematic organization and comprehensive scope made it a model for legal development throughout medieval Europe. The code's principles would later influence the legal traditions of the Christian kingdoms that emerged during the Reconquista, while its specific provisions continued to be cited in Iberian courts for centuries after the Visigothic kingdom's collapse. The code's treatment of royal authority reflected the complex balance of power that characterized Visigothic governance. While affirming the king's supreme position within the political hierarchy, the Liber Judiciorum also established clear limitations on royal power. The nobility retained significant rights and privileges, including their traditional role in royal elections and their immunity from certain forms of royal punishment. These provisions reflected the contractual nature of Visigothic kingship, which was based on mutual obligations between rulers and subjects, rather than absolute monarchical authority. The king was powerful, but his power was constrained by law, custom, and the practical necessity of maintaining noble support. Despite these institutional achievements, the Visigothic kingdom struggled with chronic political instability that would ultimately prove fatal. The elective nature of kingship created constant opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge royal authority. Succession crises became increasingly frequent and violent, with rival claimants often resorting to civil war. The reign of King Wamba, 672 to 680, illustrated both the potential strengths and inherent weaknesses of the Visigothic system. Wamba demonstrated considerable military skill in suppressing rebellions and defending the kingdom's borders. His administrative reforms strengthened royal authority and improved the kingdom's defensive capabilities. However, his eventual deposition through a palace conspiracy revealed the fragility of even successful Visigothic rulers when faced with determined noble opposition. Wamba was drugged, tonsured as a monk, and forced to abdicate, a fate that demonstrated how easily political rivals could circumvent the formal mechanisms of royal succession. The kingdom's military organization reflected these internal tensions. The Visigothic army combined traditional Germanic warrior bands with Roman-influenced professional units, creating a force that was potentially formidable but often unreliable. Noble contingents owed personal loyalty to their immediate commanders rather than the crown, making it difficult for kings to maintain unified command during extended campaigns. This fragmentation of military authority would prove particularly problematic when the kingdom faced external threats requiring coordinated responses. The army that should have defended Hispania against invasion was instead a collection of semi-independent forces whose cooperation depended on political circumstances rather than institutional loyalty. The economic foundations of Visigothic power also showed signs of strain by the late 7th century. The kingdom's wealth depended heavily on agricultural production and tribute from conquered territories, both of which were vulnerable to external disruption. The loss of Mediterranean territories to Byzantine reconquest reduced the kingdom's resources, while increasing pressure from Frankish expansion in the north forced expensive defensive measures that strained royal finances. The reign of King Egica, 687 to 702, marked the beginning of the kingdom's final crisis period. Egica's attempts to strengthen royal authority through administrative centralization and military reform provoked widespread noble resistance, leading to a series of rebellions that weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities. His decision to associate his son Witiza as co-ruler represented an attempt to ensure dynastic succession, but this innovation contradicted established Visigothic traditions and generated additional opposition from nobles who saw their electoral rights being circumvented. The circumstances surrounding Witiza's death and Roderic's subsequent accession to the throne in 710 remain historically controversial. What is certain is that the political crisis they precipitated was catastrophic. Witiza's supporters, led by prominent nobles including Count Julian of Ceuta, refused to accept Roderic's legitimacy and began seeking external allies to support their cause. This internal division would prove fatal when Muslim forces began probing the kingdom's southern defenses. The Visigothic kingdom's institutional achievements, its sophisticated legal codes, its integration of religious and secular authority, its administrative innovations, could not overcome the fundamental political instability that plagued its final decades. The elective monarchy, that had once been a source of strength, became a fatal weakness when faced with external threats requiring unified leadership and coordinated response. The kingdom that had survived for 3 centuries would collapse in a matter of months, swept away by invaders who exploited the very divisions that Visigothic institutions had failed to resolve. The political turmoil consuming the Visigothic kingdom in its final years created precisely the conditions that Muslim commanders across the Strait of Gibraltar had been monitoring with keen interest. The Umayyad Caliphate's expansion across North Africa had reached the Atlantic coast by 708, bringing Islamic forces to within sight of the Iberian Peninsula. The strategic importance of controlling the strait was immediately apparent to Muslim military leaders. Possession of both shores would secure their North African conquests while opening new territories for expansion. The narrow waterway separating Africa from Europe, just 14 kilometers at its narrowest point, was not a barrier but an invitation. The initial Muslim reconnaissance of Iberian defenses began in 710 under the direction of Tarif ibn Malik, who led a small force across the strait to probe Visigothic coastal fortifications. These preliminary raids revealed the kingdom's military weakness and internal divisions, information that was quickly relayed to Musa ibn Nusayr, the Umayyad governor of Ifriqiya. Musa's strategic assessment concluded that the Visigothic kingdom presented an opportunity for rapid conquest that could be achieved with relatively modest forces if properly coordinated with internal opposition to King Roderick. The disaffected supporters of the late King Witiza were actively seeking allies against the man they considered a usurper. They would provide intelligence, supplies, and potentially military support. The selection of Tariq ibn Ziyad to lead the main invasion force reflected careful consideration of the campaign's requirements. Tariq commanded a mixed force of Arab cavalry and Berber infantry that had proven effective in North African campaigns. His personal reputation for tactical flexibility made him well suited for operations in unfamiliar territory. The invasion force that assembled at Tangier in early 711 numbered approximately 7,000 men, a relatively small army by contemporary standards, but one that was disciplined, experienced, and highly motivated by the prospect of conquest and the religious merit of jihad. The crossing itself took place in April 711, with Muslim forces landing at the rocky promontory that would subsequently bear Tariq's name as Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. The landing site was chosen for its defensive advantages rather than its proximity to major population centers. The towering limestone cliffs provided natural fortification against counterattack, while the narrow beach allowed for controlled disembarkation of troops and supplies. Tariq's first priority was establishing a secure base of operations, from which his forces could launch systematic attacks on Visigothic positions throughout southern Hispania. The initial phase of the campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of Muslim tactical doctrine when applied against Visigothic defensive strategies. Rather than attempting to storm heavily fortified positions, Muslim commanders employed rapid cavalry movements to bypass strong points and strike at communications networks linking Visigothic garrisons. This approach exploited the kingdom's fundamental weakness in coordinating responses across its extensive territory. Isolated commanders were unable to determine whether attacks on their positions represented local raids or components of a larger strategic offensive. King Roderic's response to the invasion revealed the extent to which political divisions had compromised the kingdom's military effectiveness. The king was campaigning against Basque rebels in the north when news of the Muslim landing reached Toledo, forcing him to abandon operations against a familiar enemy to confront an unknown threat in the south. The time required to recall scattered forces and organize a coordinated response provided Muslim commanders with crucial weeks to consolidate their positions and gather intelligence about Visigothic military capabilities. By the time Roderic's army finally assembled, Tariq had established a firm foothold and understood exactly what he was facing. The assembly of the Visigothic army that would confront Tariq's forces represented both the kingdom's remaining military potential and its fatal internal contradictions. Roderic managed to gather approximately 25,000 troops, a force that significantly outnumbered the Muslim invaders and should theoretically have possessed decisive advantages in any direct confrontation. However, this numerical superiority was compromised by the questionable loyalty of contingents commanded by nobles who disputed Roderic's legitimacy, particularly those associated with the supporters of the deceased King Witiza. These men had been summoned to fight for a king they considered illegitimate, against invaders who might prove useful allies in their own political struggles. The Battle of Guadalete, fought in July 711 near the Barbate River, became the decisive engagement that determined the fate of Visigothic Hispania. The battlefield itself was a rolling plain that favored cavalry operations, giving both sides opportunities to employ their mounted forces effectively. Roderic positioned his army in traditional formation with heavy infantry at the center and cavalry on the wings, a deployment that had proven successful in previous campaigns against Frankish and Byzantine opponents. The Visigothic heavy cavalry, armored warriors mounted on powerful horses, should have been able to sweep aside the lighter Muslim forces through sheer weight of impact. Tariq's tactical approach reflected the military innovations that had enabled Muslim forces to achieve rapid conquests across vast territories. Rather than accepting a static confrontation, Muslim commanders employed fluid cavalry tactics designed to disrupt enemy formations through repeated charges and withdrawals. Berber cavalry harassed Visigothic positions with archery and javelin attacks, while Arab heavy cavalry concentrated on specific points in the enemy line to achieve local breakthroughs that could be exploited by follow-up forces. The Muslim army was smaller, but it was faster, more flexible, and better coordinated. The battle's turning point came when contingents commanded by Witiza's supporters abandoned their positions, leaving gaps in the Visigothic line that Muslim cavalry immediately exploited. Whether this withdrawal represented deliberate treachery or simply the collapse of units whose commanders had been killed remains historically unclear. The effects were immediately catastrophic for Roderic's army. The king himself disappeared during the fighting, with only his horse and royal regalia subsequently recovered from the battlefield. He was almost certainly killed, though his body was never positively identified. The Visigothic army disintegrated, its survivors scattering across the peninsula in desperate flight. The psychological impact of Guadalete extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The complete destruction of the kingdom's main army, combined with the king's death or disappearance, eliminated the central authority around which resistance might have organized. Visigothic nobles throughout the peninsula faced a choice between futile resistance and negotiated submission. Most chose the latter option as Muslim forces advanced rapidly toward major population centers. The speed of this advance reflected both superior organization and the collapse of Visigothic resistance networks. Within months of the battle, Muslim forces had occupied Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo, encountering minimal opposition from demoralized garrisons. The capture of the Visigothic capital was particularly significant, as it provided Muslim commanders with access to the kingdom's administrative records and treasury, facilitating the transition from military conquest to political administration. Musa ibn Nusayr's arrival in Hispania, with reinforcements in 712, marked the beginning of systematic territorial consolidation. Musa brought an additional 18,000 troops, including significant numbers of Arab cavalry and siege specialists capable of reducing fortified positions that had initially been bypassed. His forces concentrated on securing the peninsula's Mediterranean coast and establishing communications with Muslim territories in North Africa, while Tariq's army continued operations in the interior regions. The division of operational responsibilities reflected standard Umayyad military doctrine for large-scale conquests. Tariq's forces maintained pressure on remaining Visigothic strongholds while preventing the formation of organized resistance movements. Musa's army focused on establishing the administrative infrastructure necessary for long-term occupation. This coordinated approach enabled Muslim forces to maintain military momentum while simultaneously beginning the complex process of governing conquered territories. The administrative organization of newly conquered territories followed established Umayyad practices that had proven successful in previous conquests. The peninsula was initially organized as a single province under the authority of a governor appointed directly by the caliph in Damascus, with subordinate administrators responsible for specific regions. This centralized structure ensured unified command, while providing flexibility to address local conditions and populations. The appointment of governors reflected the caliphate's need to balance military effectiveness with political reliability. Early governors were typically experienced military commanders who had demonstrated competence in previous campaigns, but they were also required to possess the administrative skills necessary for managing complex civil populations. The establishment of Islamic legal and administrative structures proceeded systematically across conquered territories. Muslim administrators implemented the dhimmi system that had been developed during previous conquests, providing a framework for governing non-Muslim populations according to Islamic law while preserving certain traditional practices. Christian and Jewish communities were granted protected status in exchange for payment of specific taxes and acceptance of certain legal restrictions. The jizya, a poll tax levied on non-Muslims, became the primary marker of dhimmi status, while the kharaj, a land tax, applied to agricultural properties regardless of the owner's religion. The dhimmi system's practical implementation varied considerably across different regions and communities. Urban Christian populations, particularly those with established ecclesiastical hierarchies, generally received more favorable treatment than rural communities that lacked organized leadership. The system's flexibility allowed Muslim administrators to negotiate specific arrangements with different groups, creating a complex patchwork of local agreements that reflected varying degrees of autonomy and obligation. Christian religious practices continued under Islamic rule, though with significant modifications to their previous status. Churches remained open for worship, and Christian clergy retained authority over their congregation's spiritual affairs. But new church construction required specific permission from Muslim authorities, and the collection of ecclesiastical taxes was redirected to Islamic administrators, fundamentally altering the economic foundations of Christian religious institutions. The northern mountainous regions of the peninsula presented unique challenges for Muslim administrators attempting to establish comprehensive control. The rugged terrain of Asturias, Cantabria, and the Pyrenean foothills had historically served as refuges for populations seeking to avoid central authority. These geographical advantages proved equally valuable against Islamic forces. Small groups of Visigothic nobles and their followers established themselves in remote valleys where cavalry-based Muslim armies could not operate effectively. The resistance movement that emerged in these northern regions initially consisted of scattered bands of refugees rather than organized military forces. These groups included Visigothic nobles who had escaped the disaster at Guadalete, Christian clergy opposed to Islamic rule, and local populations with strong traditions of independence. Their initial activities focused on survival rather than systematic opposition, as they lacked the resources and coordination necessary for effective military operations. The emergence of Pelayo as a leader of northern resistance marked a crucial transition from desperate refuge to organized rebellion. Pelayo's background as a Visigothic noble provided him with the military experience and social connections necessary to unite disparate resistance groups under unified command. His ability to establish a secure base in the Asturian mountains created the foundation for sustained operations against Muslim positions in northern regions. The Battle of Covadonga in 722 represented the first significant military success achieved by Christian resistance forces since the Islamic conquest. The engagement took place in a narrow mountain valley where Muslim cavalry advantages were neutralized by terrain, allowing Christian infantry to achieve tactical parity with their opponents. Pelayo's forces employed guerrilla tactics that maximized their knowledge of local geography while minimizing direct confrontation with superior Muslim forces. The ambush caught the Muslim expedition off guard, and the confined terrain prevented them from bringing their numerical superiority to bear. The battle's strategic significance extended beyond its immediate military results. Covadonga demonstrated that Muslim forces were not invincible, and that organized resistance could achieve meaningful victories under favorable conditions. The psychological impact of this success enabled Pelayo to attract additional supporters and establish the foundation for what would eventually become the Kingdom of Asturias, the first stable Christian polity to emerge from the wreckage of the Visigothic kingdom. The establishment of Al-Andalus as a distinct political entity within the Umayyad Caliphate reflected the peninsula's integration into the broader Islamic world. The name itself derived from the Arabic rendering of Vandal, connecting the new Islamic territory to the peninsula's earlier Germanic inhabitants. This nomenclature suggested continuity with previous historical periods while establishing the region's new Islamic identity within the expanding caliphate. The development of Islamic urban centers proceeded rapidly as Muslim administrators recognized the importance of establishing permanent bases for their authority. Cordoba emerged as the peninsula's primary administrative center, with extensive construction projects designed to accommodate the growing Muslim population and demonstrate Islamic power. The city's strategic location on the Guadalquivir River provided excellent communications with both the Mediterranean coast and the interior regions, making it an ideal capital for the new province. Roman bridges, aqueducts, and roads were repaired and expanded, while new mosques, markets, and administrative buildings transformed the urban landscape. The political landscape of Al-Andalus underwent a dramatic transformation in 756, when Abd al-Rahman ibn Muawiyah, the sole surviving member of the Umayyad dynasty, arrived on Iberian shores. The young prince's journey to the peninsula represented one of the most remarkable episodes of survival and political resurrection in medieval history. The Abbasid Revolution of 750 had swept across the Islamic world with unprecedented ferocity, targeting the Umayyad dynasty for complete extermination. The new Abbasid caliphs, claiming legitimacy through their descent from the Prophet's uncle Abbas, systematically hunted down every member of the previous ruling family. The massacre at a supposed reconciliation banquet near the Jordan River eliminated most of the Umayyad princes in a single night of coordinated butchery. Abd al-Rahman, then barely 20 years old, escaped the slaughter only through the quick thinking of his loyal servant, who helped him flee across the Euphrates while Abbasid soldiers searched every house in Damascus. The prince's 5-year odyssey through North Africa had been a constant struggle for survival. Moving from one Berber tribe to another, he had witnessed firsthand the political fragmentation that characterized the Maghreb in the aftermath of the Abbasid takeover. His mother's Berber ancestry provided crucial connections that kept him alive, but it also made him acutely aware of the ethnic tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Islamic unity. Abd al-Rahman's decision to cross into Hispania was based on careful intelligence gathering rather than desperate improvisation. His agents had reported that Al-Andalus remained nominally under Abbasid authority, but was effectively controlled by competing factions of Arabs and Berbers, whose loyalties were questionable at best. The province's distance from Baghdad made direct Abbasid intervention difficult, while the mixed population of Arabs, Berbers, and Hispano-Romans created opportunities for a skilled politician to build coalitions across ethnic lines. The young prince saw his chance and took it. He landed near Al-Munakkar on the Granada coast in August 755, with fewer than a dozen supporters. But his Umayyad lineage immediately attracted attention from Arab settlers who had grown increasingly dissatisfied with Abbasid rule. Many of these Arabs were descendants of the original conquest forces, who had established themselves as a military aristocracy throughout southern Al-Andalus. They possessed extensive landholdings and commanded significant military resources, but they lacked the dynastic legitimacy necessary to challenge Abbasid authority directly. Abd al-Rahman provided exactly what they needed: a prince of the blood, a living symbol of the old order around whom opposition could coalesce. The existing governor, Yusuf al-Fihri, represented the type of provincial administrator that the Abbasids typically appointed to distant territories. A capable military commander with extensive experience in North African campaigns, Yusuf had maintained relative stability in Al-Andalus through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic use of force. However, his authority rested entirely on Abbasid support, and his policies had increasingly favored certain tribal groups over others, creating resentments that Abd al-Rahman could exploit. The Yemeni Arabs in particular had found themselves excluded from key positions and lucrative appointments, despite their significant role in the original conquest. Abd al-Rahman's agents worked systematically to convince tribal leaders that Umayyad restoration offered better prospects for advancement than continued submission to distant Abbasid authority. The young prince's personal charisma played a crucial role in these negotiations, as his bearing and eloquence convinced skeptical commanders that he possessed the qualities necessary for successful leadership. The military campaign that followed demonstrated Abd al-Rahman's remarkable ability to transform political support into effective fighting force. His army grew steadily as it advanced through Andalusian territories, with entire tribal contingents switching sides as news of Umayyad victories spread. The decisive confrontation with Yusuf's forces took place near Cordoba in May 756, on a broad plain that allowed both armies to deploy their cavalry effectively. Abd al-Rahman commanded approximately 10,000 troops, a mixture of Arab cavalry and Berber infantry, whose effectiveness had been tested in previous engagements. Yusuf's army was larger, but included significant numbers of recently recruited troops whose loyalty remained questionable under battlefield conditions. The battle unfolded according to classical Islamic tactical principles, with both sides employing the traditional formation of center infantry supported by cavalry wings. Abd al-Rahman positioned himself prominently in the front ranks, his distinctive white banner clearly visible to both his supporters and enemies. This personal leadership style, which he had learned during his years of exile, proved crucial in maintaining unit cohesion during the intense fighting that followed. The turning point came when several of Yusuf's tribal contingents recognized the futility of continued resistance and began withdrawing from the battlefield. These defections created gaps in the loyalist line that Abd al-Rahman's cavalry immediately exploited, transforming what had been a closely contested engagement into a rout. Yusuf himself was killed while attempting to rally his remaining forces, eliminating the last significant obstacle to Umayyad control of Al-Andalus. The establishment of the independent Umayyad Emirate required more than military victory. It demanded the creation of entirely new governmental structures that could function without reference to external authority. Abd al-Rahman, now styling himself as Amir Abd al-Rahman I, faced the complex challenge of governing a territory that had never existed as an independent political entity. His solution was to adapt traditional Islamic administrative practices to local conditions, while maintaining the essential symbols and ceremonies of legitimate rule. The new emir's approach to governance reflected his understanding that successful rule in Al-Andalus required balancing the competing interests of multiple ethnic and religious communities. The Arab military aristocracy expected to maintain their privileged position as the conquest elite. Berber tribes demanded recognition of their crucial role in establishing Umayyad authority. The Hispano-Roman population, now increasingly referred to as Muwallids as they converted to Islam, sought opportunities for advancement within the new system. Abd al-Rahman's administrative innovations began with the establishment of a professional bureaucracy that could function independently of tribal loyalties. He recruited talented administrators from all ethnic backgrounds, promoting individuals based on competence rather than ancestry. This meritocratic approach created a class of civil servants whose primary loyalty was to the emirate itself, rather than to particular tribal or ethnic groups. The military organization of the new emirate reflected similar pragmatic considerations. Abd al-Rahman maintained the traditional Arab cavalry units that formed the core of his fighting force, but he also incorporated Berber infantry and began recruiting from the Hispano-Roman population. This mixed military structure provided tactical flexibility while distributing the burden of military service across different communities. The consolidation of Umayyad power required systematic campaigns against both internal opponents and external threats. The northern frontier remained contested territory where Christian kingdoms were beginning to organize effective resistance, while various Muslim factions throughout Al-Andalus continued to challenge emirate authority. Abd al-Rahman's military strategy focused on eliminating these threats systematically, while avoiding the type of overextension that had weakened previous rulers. The campaign against the Abbasid expedition of 763 demonstrated the emirate's growing military effectiveness. When the Abbasid Caliph finally dispatched a substantial force to restore his authority in Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman's army met the invaders with confidence and superior knowledge of local terrain. The resulting battle near Carmona resulted in a decisive Umayyad victory that effectively ended Abbasid hopes of reconquering the peninsula through military force. The development of Cordoba as the Emirates' capital reflected Abd al-Rahman's vision of creating a worthy successor to Damascus. The city's existing Roman and Visigothic infrastructure provided an excellent foundation for expansion, while its location on the Guadalquivir River ensured excellent communications with both the Mediterranean coast and the interior regions. The emir's construction projects transformed Cordoba from a provincial administrative center into a magnificent capital that rivaled the great cities of the Islamic world. The expansion of the Great Mosque of Cordoba began during Abd al-Rahman's reign and continued under his successors, eventually becoming one of the architectural marvels of medieval Europe. The mosque's distinctive horseshoe arches and alternating red and white stonework created a visual style that was uniquely Andalusian, while maintaining clear connections to broader Islamic architectural traditions. The building's massive prayer hall could accommodate thousands of worshippers, reflecting both the city's growing Muslim population and the Emirates' increasing prosperity. The mosque construction employed skilled craftsmen from throughout the Mediterranean world, including Christian artisans whose techniques were incorporated into Islamic decorative schemes. The resulting synthesis of architectural traditions produced innovations that would influence building styles throughout the Western Islamic world. The economic foundations of the Emirates' prosperity rested on the peninsula's agricultural productivity and its strategic position controlling trade routes between Europe and Africa. The Guadalquivir Valley's fertile soils supported extensive cultivation of grains, olives, and grapes, while the introduction of new crops from the Islamic world expanded agricultural possibilities. Irrigation systems originally developed during Roman times were expanded and improved, supporting more intensive cultivation and higher population densities. The introduction of crops like rice, sugarcane, cotton, and citrus fruits transformed Andalusian agriculture, while new techniques for water management enabled cultivation in areas that had previously been marginal. The emergence of Mozarabic Christian communities represented one of the most distinctive features of Andalusian society. These Christians, who adopted Arabic language and Islamic cultural practices while maintaining their religious identity, occupied a unique position within the Emirates' social hierarchy. Their knowledge of both Christian and Islamic traditions made them valuable intermediaries in diplomatic and commercial relationships, while their technical skills contributed significantly to the Emirates' economic development. Mozarabic communities developed their own distinctive cultural identity that blended Christian theological traditions with Islamic social practices. Their churches featured architectural elements borrowed from mosque design, while their liturgical practices incorporated Arabic musical forms and poetic structures. This cultural synthesis created a unique form of Christianity that was distinctly Andalusian, while maintaining connections to broader Christian traditions. The transformation of the Umayyad Emirate into a full caliphate represented far more than a mere change in title when Abd al-Rahman III proclaimed himself commander of the faithful in 929. This declaration constituted a direct challenge to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and marked the definitive break of Al-Andalus from any pretense of Eastern Islamic authority. The political significance of this act reverberated throughout the Islamic world. Abd al-Rahman III asserted not only his independence from Baghdad, but his equality with the Abbasid and Fatimid caliphs, who claimed universal authority over all Muslims. Three caliphs now competed for the allegiance of the Islamic world, and one of them ruled from European soil. The circumstances that led to this momentous decision had been building throughout the early decades of the 10th century. The Abbasid Caliphate's authority had been steadily fragmenting, as provincial governors established de facto independence while maintaining nominal allegiance to Baghdad. Simultaneously, the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa created a competing center of Islamic authority that directly threatened Umayyad interests in the Western Mediterranean. The Fatimids' aggressive expansion eastward toward Egypt and their claims to represent the true Islamic succession forced Abd al-Rahman III to respond with equally bold assertions of legitimacy. The new caliph's assumption of the title al-Nasir li din Allah, defender of God's religion, carried profound theological and political implications. Unlike the emirate, which had governed Al-Andalus as a regional political entity, the caliphate claimed spiritual authority over all Muslims within its territories and beyond. This transformation required the development of new ceremonial protocols, administrative structures, and diplomatic relationships that reflected Cordoba's enhanced status within the Islamic world. The caliph was no longer merely a regional ruler, but a claimant to universal Islamic leadership. The physical manifestation of this elevated status became apparent in the massive expansion of the palace complex at Madinat al-Zahra, begun in 936 as Abd al-Rahman III's new administrative center. Located on the slopes of the Sierra Morena northwest of Cordoba, this Palatine city was designed to rival the great palace complexes of Baghdad and Cairo. The construction project employed thousands of skilled craftsmen and consumed enormous resources, but it served the crucial political purpose of demonstrating that the Cordoban Caliphate possessed the wealth and sophistication necessary to support such magnificent displays of power. The palace's architectural program incorporated elements from throughout the Islamic world, while developing distinctively Andalusian innovations. The reception halls featured elaborate geometric decorations executed in carved marble and stucco, while the private apartments included sophisticated hydraulic systems that supplied running water and operated decorative fountains. The complex's gardens employed advanced irrigation techniques to maintain lush vegetation in the Mediterranean climate, creating an earthly paradise that symbolized the caliph's divine mandate to rule. Foreign ambassadors who visited Madinat al-Zahra returned home with tales of splendor that enhanced Cordoba's reputation throughout the known world. The military campaigns that established Abd al-Rahman III's reputation as a formidable commander began with the systematic reduction of rebel strongholds that had challenged Umayyad authority throughout the early 10th century. The most significant of these operations targeted the fortress of Bobastro, which had served as the center of Omar ibn Hafsun's rebellion for over 4 decades. This stronghold, perched on a virtually impregnable rocky outcrop in the Malaga Mountains, had become a symbol of resistance to central authority and a refuge for various dissident groups. The siege of Bobastro required innovative military engineering and sustained logistical support that demonstrated the caliphate's enhanced organizational capabilities. Abd al-Rahman III's engineers constructed elaborate siege works that gradually tightened the noose around the fortress, while his supply trains maintained the besieging army through multiple campaigning seasons. The fortress finally surrendered in 928, eliminating the last major internal threat to Umayyad authority and freeing the caliph's forces for operations against external enemies. The northern frontier campaigns against the Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Navarre represented the most sustained military effort of Abd al-Rahman III's reign. These operations were not random raids for plunder, but carefully coordinated strategic campaigns designed to prevent Christian consolidation while extending Islamic control into the Duero Valley. The Caliph personally led many of these expeditions, demonstrating his commitment to the frontier struggle and inspiring his troops through direct participation in combat. His presence on campaign served both military and political purposes, reinforcing his authority while preventing the emergence of overly powerful military commanders who might challenge his rule. The campaign of 939 against Ramiro II of Leon illustrated both the potential and limitations of Cordoban military power. Abd al-Rahman III assembled a massive army that included contingents from throughout Al-Andalus, supported by siege engines and extensive supply trains. The Christian forces that met this invasion at Simancas employed defensive tactics that maximized their knowledge of local terrain, while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Muslim cavalry. The resulting battle became a tactical disaster for the Cordoban forces, with the Caliph himself barely escaping capture when his army disintegrated under sustained Christian attacks. The defeat at Simancas forced a fundamental reassessment of military strategy and led to significant reforms in the organization and tactics of Cordoban armies. Abd al-Rahman III recognized that the traditional reliance on tribal cavalry, while effective in open terrain, was inadequate for operations in the mountainous regions where Christian forces typically chose to fight. His military reforms emphasized the development of professional infantry units equipped with improved armor and weapons, while new tactical manuals addressed the specific challenges of frontier warfare. The recovery from the Simancas disaster demonstrated the underlying strength of the Cordoban state and Abd al-Rahman III's political skill in maintaining support despite military setbacks. Rather than abandoning frontier operations entirely, the Caliph adopted a more cautious approach that emphasized the construction of fortified bases and the establishment of reliable supply lines. This methodical strategy proved more effective than previous aggressive campaigns, gradually extending Cordoban control northward while avoiding catastrophic defeats. The reign of Al-Hakam II, who succeeded his father in 961, marked the zenith of Cordoban cultural and intellectual achievement. The new caliph's passion for learning and scholarship transformed Cordoba into one of Europe's most important centers of intellectual activity, rivaling Baghdad and Cairo in the breadth and sophistication of its scholarly institutions. Al-Hakam's personal library reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes, making it one of the largest collections of books in the medieval world. The Caliph employed agents throughout the Islamic world to acquire rare manuscripts, and his scribes produced copies that were distributed to scholars and institutions throughout Al-Andalus. The Caliph's patronage extended to scholars from throughout the Islamic world and beyond, creating an international community of intellectuals who made Cordoba a center for translation, commentary, and original research. Greek philosophical texts that had been lost in Western Europe were preserved and studied in Arabic translation, while original works in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and jurisprudence advanced human knowledge in multiple fields. The city's madrasas and libraries attracted students from as far away as Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, establishing Cordoba's reputation as a premier destination for Islamic learning. The translation movement that flourished under Al-Hakam II's patronage played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge to later generations. Teams of translators working in the palace library produced Arabic versions of Greek scientific and philosophical works, often improving upon the original texts through detailed commentary and analysis. These translations would later be rendered into Latin by scholars in Christian kingdoms, facilitating the transmission of classical learning to medieval Europe. The development of distinctive Andalusian schools of Islamic jurisprudence reflected the intellectual sophistication that characterized the Caliphate during this period. Cordoban legal scholars developed innovative approaches to interpreting Islamic law, that addressed the specific conditions of life in Al-Andalus, while maintaining orthodoxy with broader Islamic legal traditions. The artistic achievements of the Caliphal period represented a synthesis of influences from throughout the Islamic world, combined with local innovations that created distinctively Andalusian forms of expression. The decorative programs of major architectural projects employed sophisticated geometric patterns and calligraphic inscriptions that demonstrated both technical mastery and aesthetic refinement. The ivory caskets produced in Cordoban workshops during this period are considered among the finest examples of Islamic decorative art, combining intricate carving with sophisticated iconographic programs. These luxury objects were prized throughout the Mediterranean world and served as diplomatic gifts that enhanced Cordoba's prestige. The economic foundations of this cultural flowering rested on the Caliphate's control of lucrative trade routes connecting Europe with Africa and the Eastern Islamic world. Cordoba's merchants established commercial networks that extended from the North Sea to the Sahara, trading European furs and amber for African gold and ivory. The city's workshops produced luxury goods that were highly prized throughout the Mediterranean, while its agricultural hinterland supplied the foodstuffs necessary to support a large urban population. Cordoba may have been the largest city in Western Europe during this period, with a population estimated at several hundred thousand. The diplomatic relationships that the Cordoban Caliphate maintained with distant powers reflected its emergence as a major player in Mediterranean politics. Byzantine emperors sought Cordoban support against Fatimid expansion in the eastern Mediterranean, while European rulers recognized the Caliphate as a legitimate sovereign power worthy of formal diplomatic recognition. These relationships were maintained through elaborate embassy exchanges that demonstrated the Caliphate's wealth and sophistication to foreign observers. The most significant of these diplomatic relationships was the complex interaction with the Byzantine Empire, which shared the Caliphate's opposition to Fatimid expansion but remained suspicious of Islamic power in the Western Mediterranean. The exchange of embassies between Constantinople and Cordoba resulted in detailed accounts of both courts that provide valuable insights into 10th century diplomatic practices. Byzantine observers were consistently impressed by the wealth and sophistication they encountered in Cordoba, while Cordoban diplomats reported extensively on Byzantine military capabilities and political organization. The rise of al-Mansur during the final decades of the 10th century marked a fundamental transformation in the character of the Cordoban state. Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, who adopted the title al-Mansur bi Allah, made victorious by God, emerged from the administrative hierarchy to become the de facto ruler of the Caliphate, while the legitimate Caliph Hisham II remained secluded in the palace. This concentration of power in the hands of a military dictator represented a departure from the established traditions of Umayyad governance, but it also enabled the Caliphate to achieve unprecedented military successes against its Christian neighbors. Al-Mansur was not a usurper in the traditional sense. He never claimed the caliphal title for himself. Instead, he ruled through the caliph, maintaining the fiction of Umayyad authority while exercising real power. Al-Mansur's military campaigns against the northern Christian kingdoms were characterized by their systematic nature and devastating effectiveness. Unlike previous frontier operations that had often been limited raids for plunder, Al-Mansur's expeditions were carefully planned strategic campaigns designed to destroy Christian military capabilities and prevent the formation of effective coalitions against Islamic power. His forces employed sophisticated intelligence networks to identify vulnerable targets while avoiding heavily defended positions that might result in costly sieges. The campaigns followed a relentless annual rhythm. Every summer, Al-Mansur's armies marched north, burning, looting, and destroying everything in their path. The sack of Santiago de Compostela in 997 represented the pinnacle of al-Mansur's military achievements and one of the most shocking events in medieval Iberian history. The destruction of Christianity's most important pilgrimage site in the peninsula sent reverberations throughout Christian Europe while demonstrating the extent of Islamic military superiority during this period. Al-Mansur's forces systematically dismantled the cathedral and carried away its bells to Cordoba, where they were incorporated into the Great Mosque as symbols of Islamic triumph. Christian captives were forced to carry the bells on their shoulders during the Long March south, a deliberate humiliation designed to demonstrate Muslim dominance. The administrative and military innovations that enabled al-Mansur's successes fundamentally altered the structure of the Cordoban state. His creation of a professional army loyal to him personally, rather than to the Umayyad dynasty, represented a break with traditional Islamic military organization. This force included significant numbers of Berber troops recruited from North Africa, as well as Christian mercenaries, whose effectiveness in familiar terrain made them valuable additions to Islamic armies. These soldiers owed their positions and pay to al-Mansur, not to the caliph, creating a military establishment that was essentially independent of traditional authority structures. The economic strain imposed by al-Mansur's constant military campaigns began to undermine the foundations of Cordoban prosperity. Even as his armies achieved unprecedented victories, the enormous costs of maintaining large professional forces in the field required increased taxation that burdened both urban and rural populations. The disruption of normal economic activities caused by frequent military mobilizations reduced agricultural productivity and commercial activity, while the concentration of resources on military expenditures left less available for the cultural and intellectual activities that had distinguished the caliphate during its earlier phases. The succession crisis that followed al-Mansur's death in 1002 revealed the extent to which his personal rule had destabilized traditional Umayyad institutions. His son Abd al-Malik attempted to maintain his father's system of military dictatorship, but he lacked the personal charisma and political skill necessary to hold together the complex coalition of interests that had supported al-Mansur's regime. The death of Abd al-Malik in 1008 precipitated a complete breakdown of central authority that would ultimately destroy the caliphate as an effective political entity. The fitna, civil war, that followed lasted over 2 decades and witnessed the systematic destruction of everything the Umayyads had built. The collapse of centralized authority in Cordoba unleashed forces that had been building beneath the surface of Umayyad rule for generations. Competing factions of Arabs, Berbers, and Slavic military slaves fought for control of the caliphal title, while provincial governors declared independence and carved out their own territories. The sack of Cordoba by Berber forces in 1013 marked the definitive end of the city's role as the undisputed center of Iberian Islamic power. The magnificent palaces of Madinat al-Zahra were looted and burned, their treasures scattered across the peninsula. The great library of al-Hakam II was dispersed, its precious manuscripts sold or destroyed. What emerged from this breakdown was not another unified Islamic state, but rather a constellation of independent kingdoms known as the Taifa states. Each was ruled by ambitious military commanders, tribal leaders, or local notables who carved out territories from the wreckage of the once mighty caliphate. The formal abolition of the caliphate in 1031, when the last Umayyad claimant was deposed, merely acknowledged a reality that had existed for years. The golden age of Al-Andalus was over. What followed would be very different. The fragmentation process that created the Taifa kingdoms reflected the underlying ethnic and regional tensions that Umayyad rule had managed to contain but never fully resolve. In Seville, the Abadid family established control through their leadership of the Arab population, creating a kingdom that would eventually dominate much of southwestern Al-Andalus. The Abadids traced their lineage to prominent Arab families from the original conquest period, and their rule represented the assertion of Arab ethnic identity against both Berber and Slavic competitors for regional dominance. Their court became famous for its poetry and culture, but this refinement masked a ruthless approach to political survival. The Berber populations that had played such a crucial role in al-Mansur's military machine established their own independent kingdoms throughout southern and eastern Al-Andalus. The Zirid Kingdom of Granada emerged as the most significant of these Berber states, controlling the rich agricultural valleys of the Genil and Darro rivers, along with the strategic mountain passes that connected the Mediterranean coast with the interior plateau. Zirid military effectiveness, honed through generations of frontier warfare, enabled them to maintain independence against both Christian and Muslim competitors, while establishing Granada as a major center of Islamic culture and learning. The kingdom would prove remarkably durable, surviving long after most other Taifa states had been absorbed by larger powers. The Slavic military commanders, who had served as the backbone of the later Umayyad military establishment, created several small but strategically important kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast. These Slavic rulers, many of whom had originally been captured as children during raids into Christian territories and raised as Muslim military slaves, possessed intimate knowledge of both Islamic and Christian military practices. The Kingdom of Zaragoza, established by the Tujibid family, represented a different model of Taifa formation based on control of crucial frontier territories. The Tujibids had served as Umayyad governors of the Upper March for generations, developing extensive networks of local alliances and detailed knowledge of the region's complex geography. The kingdom encompassed the fertile Ebro Valley, along with the mountain fortresses that controlled access to the Christian kingdoms of Navarre and Aragon, making Zaragoza a crucial player in the shifting balance of power between Islamic and Christian forces. The proliferation of independent Taifa kingdoms created unprecedented opportunities for the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia, which had spent centuries struggling against the overwhelming military superiority of unified Islamic power. The fragmentation of Al-Andalus meant that Christian rulers no longer faced a single coordinated enemy capable of mounting massive campaigns like those of Abd al-Rahman III or al-Mansur. Instead, they encountered a collection of rival Islamic states whose mutual hostilities could be exploited through careful diplomacy and selective military intervention. The Taifa kings were often more concerned with their Muslim neighbors than with the Christian threat to the north. The Kingdom of Leon, under the dynamic leadership of Alfonso V and his successors, began the systematic expansion southward that would characterize Christian policy throughout the Taifa period. The Leonese monarchy had survived the devastating campaigns of al-Mansur's era by developing defensive strategies based on fortified strongholds and mobile cavalry forces that could avoid direct confrontation with superior Islamic armies. The collapse of Cordoban power allowed these same military techniques to be employed offensively, as Leonese forces began occupying territories that had been under Islamic control for centuries. The balance of power had shifted, and the Christians intended to exploit it. The emergence of Castile as an independent kingdom under Ferdinand the First marked a crucial development in the balance of peninsular power. The Castilian monarchy's origins lay in the frontier counties that had borne the brunt of Islamic attacks during the previous century, creating a military culture that emphasized aggressive expansion and systematic colonization of conquered territories. Ferdinand's assumption of the imperial title following his conquest of Leon in 1037 reflected Castilian ambitions to lead the Christian reconquest of the entire peninsula. The union of Leon and Castile under a single ruler created a power capable of dominating the Taifa kingdoms through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic manipulation. The development of the Parias tribute system represented one of the most significant innovations of the Taifa period, fundamentally altering the economic relationships between Christian and Islamic kingdoms. This system, which required Taifa rulers to pay regular tribute to Christian monarchs in exchange for military protection or non-aggression agreements, reversed the traditional flow of wealth that had characterized earlier centuries. The Parias system emerged from the military realities of the new political landscape. Taifa rulers recognized that their fragmented kingdoms could not individually match the military resources of the expanding Christian monarchies. Rather than face certain destruction through military conquest, many Taifa rulers chose to purchase security through regular tribute payments that allowed them to maintain internal autonomy while acknowledging Christian superiority in military affairs. The economic impact of the Parias system on Christian kingdoms was transformative, providing unprecedented resources for military expansion, architectural projects, and administrative development. The gold that flowed northward from the Taifa kingdoms enabled Christian rulers to hire mercenary forces, construct sophisticated fortifications, and support the religious institutions that legitimized their expanding authority. The tribute system also created powerful incentives for Christian rulers to maintain the independence of their Islamic tributaries rather than conquering them outright, as living kingdoms could provide continuous revenue streams that exceeded the one-time profits of military conquest. For the Taifa kingdoms themselves, the Parias system represented a complex balance between survival and gradual subordination. The tribute payments required to maintain Christian protection placed enormous strains on royal treasuries, forcing Taifa rulers to increase taxation on their subjects and reduce expenditures on military forces and public works. This economic pressure gradually weakened the Taifa kingdom's capacity for independent action, while increasing their dependence on Christian goodwill for survival. The system was inherently unstable. It could delay conquest but not prevent it indefinitely. The desperate situation facing the Taifa kingdoms by the 1080s created conditions that would fundamentally transform the political landscape of medieval Iberia. The relentless pressure of Christian expansion, combined with the crushing burden of Parias tribute payments, had reduced many Islamic rulers to mere vassals of their northern neighbors. The capture of Toledo by Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085 sent shockwaves throughout Al-Andalus. This ancient Visigothic capital represented far more than a strategic prize. It symbolized the inexorable advance of Christian reconquest toward the heartland of Islamic Spain. The fall of Toledo exposed the military weakness that had become endemic among the Taifa kingdoms. The city's Islamic garrison, demoralized by years of tribute payments and political instability, offered only token resistance to Alfonso's siege engines. The Castilian king's systematic approach to the siege demonstrated the technological and organizational advantages that Christian forces had developed during decades of successful expansion. Alfonso VI's treatment of Toledo's conquered population revealed the increasingly harsh character of Christian expansion during this period. While earlier conquests had often preserved existing Islamic administrative structures and religious practices, the Castilian king implemented policies designed to transform Toledo into an unambiguously Christian city. The conversion of the main mosque into a cathedral proceeded immediately after the city's surrender, while new settlement policies encouraged Christian colonization of the surrounding countryside. The message was clear: this was not temporary occupation but permanent transformation. The psychological impact of Toledo's fall reverberated throughout the remaining Taifa kingdoms, forcing their rulers to confront the reality that traditional defensive strategies were no longer sufficient to ensure survival. The city had been considered one of the strongest fortresses in Al-Andalus, protected by massive walls built on Roman foundations and defended by experienced garrison troops. Its rapid collapse demonstrated that no Islamic stronghold could withstand determined Christian assault if left to fight alone. The Taifa kings needed help, and they knew where to find it. The appeals for assistance that began arriving in North Africa during 1085 represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between Iberian and Maghrebi Islamic communities. Previous contacts had been limited to commercial relationships and occasional diplomatic exchanges, but the crisis facing Al-Andalus now required direct military intervention from across the strait. The Taifa rulers who dispatched these urgent embassies understood that they were effectively acknowledging their inability to defend Islamic territories without external support. They were also inviting in a power that might prove as dangerous to their independence as the Christians they feared. The Almoravid movement that dominated the Maghreb during this period represented a puritanical reform movement that had emerged from the Saharan tribes of the western Sudan. The Almoravids, whose name derived from the Arabic al-Murabatun, those who bind themselves, had originated as a religious brotherhood dedicated to strict adherence to Islamic law and the elimination of what they considered corrupt innovations in religious practice. Their military expansion across North Africa had been driven by a combination of religious fervor and the practical advantages that their disciplined organization provided in desert warfare. The Almoravids were not just warriors, they were holy warriors, convinced that their cause was righteous and their enemies were enemies of God. The founder of Almoravid power, Abdullah ibn Yasin, had established his movement's distinctive character through rigorous religious education, combined with military training that emphasized discipline and collective action over individual heroism. The ribats, fortified monasteries that served as centers of Almoravid organization, provided both spiritual instruction and military preparation for warriors who saw themselves as engaged in perpetual holy war against the enemies of true Islam. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, who had assumed leadership of the Almoravid Confederation following Abdullah ibn Yasin's death in battle, brought to the movement the strategic vision necessary to transform it from a regional religious brotherhood into a major imperial power. His conquest of Morocco had been accomplished through a series of carefully planned campaigns that combined traditional Berber mobility with innovative siege techniques. The establishment of Marrakesh as his capital provided a strategic base for operations that could support expansion in multiple directions. The city he founded would become one of the great centers of Islamic civilization. The Almoravid military system represented a synthesis of Saharan tribal traditions with classical Islamic military doctrine that proved remarkably effective against both sedentary and nomadic opponents. The core of Almoravid armies consisted of camel-mounted warriors whose mobility and endurance had been developed through generations of desert warfare. These forces could cover vast distances without logistical support, appearing suddenly at strategic points where their concentrated attacks could achieve decisive results before disappearing back into the desert. Their discipline and religious motivation made them formidable opponents. The religious ideology that motivated Almoravid expansion emphasized the purification of Islamic practice through the elimination of innovations and the strict enforcement of Maliki legal interpretations. This puritanical approach placed the Almoravids in direct opposition to the more relaxed religious practices that had developed in the Taifa kingdoms. Centuries of coexistence with Christian and Jewish populations had created syncretic cultural forms that Orthodox reformers considered corrupting influences on true Islamic faith. The Taifa courts, with their wine, poetry, and music, represented everything the Almoravids despised. The decision to intervene in Iberian affairs required careful consideration of the strategic implications for Almoravid interests in North Africa. Yusuf ibn Tashfin understood that military operations across the strait would require substantial commitments of men and resources that might leave his Maghrebi territories vulnerable to attack from rival powers. The embassy that arrived in Marrakesh from the Taifa rulers presented their request for assistance in terms that appealed directly to Almoravid religious sensibilities. Rather than simply asking for military support against Christian enemies, the Iberian rulers portrayed their situation as a crisis of Islamic faith threatened by infidel aggression. They emphasized the desecration of mosques, the forced conversion of Muslim populations, and the general decline of Islamic religious practice under Christian pressure as justifications for immediate intervention. The appeal worked. The Almoravid army that assembled for the Iberian expedition represented the largest military force that had crossed from North Africa since the original Islamic conquest 4 centuries earlier. Contemporary sources describe a host of approximately 15,000 warriors, including elite camel cavalry, Berber infantry armed with traditional weapons, and specialized units equipped with siege engines. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's personal leadership of the expedition demonstrated the importance that the Almoravid movement placed on the Iberian intervention. The presence of the supreme commander ensured unified direction of military operations while providing the religious authority necessary to legitimate whatever political arrangements might emerge from successful campaigns. The landing of Almoravid forces at Algeciras in June 1086 marked the beginning of a new phase in Iberian Islamic history. The choice of landing site reflected careful strategic planning, as Algeciras provided excellent harbor facilities while offering direct access to the interior valleys where the main Christian armies were operating. Alfonso VI's response to intelligence reports about the Almoravid landing demonstrated both the strategic acumen that had made him the most successful Christian ruler of his generation and his perhaps excessive confidence in Castilian military superiority. Rather than adopting defensive positions, the Castilian king decided to seek immediate battle with the invading forces before they could consolidate their position. The Battle of Sagrajas, fought on October 23, 1086, near the fortress of Badajoz, became one of the most decisive engagements in medieval Iberian history. Alfonso VI positioned his army in traditional formation with heavy cavalry on the wings and infantry in the center, a deployment that had proven successful in previous campaigns against Taifa forces. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's tactical approach reflected both classical Islamic military doctrine and innovations developed through Almoravid experience in Saharan warfare. The North African commander positioned his camel cavalry in the center of his line, where their unusual mounts would have maximum psychological impact on Christian horses unfamiliar with such animals. The battle began with traditional cavalry charges, as both armies sought to achieve early advantage through shock action. The Christian heavy cavalry initially achieved significant success against Berber light horse, driving back the Islamic wings and threatening to envelop the Almoravid center. The turning point came when the Almoravid camel cavalry launched their coordinated charge against the Christian center. The unfamiliar sight and smell of the camels caused panic among Christian horses, disrupting formations that had maintained cohesion during the initial cavalry exchanges. The collapse of Christian resistance occurred with shocking suddenness, as unit after unit broke and fled from the battlefield. Alfonso VI himself was wounded during the fighting and barely escaped capture when his bodyguard was overwhelmed by pursuing Almoravid cavalry. The Castilian baggage train fell intact into North African hands, along with the royal standard and other symbols of Christian military prestige. The immediate aftermath of Sagrajas revealed the extent of the Christian disaster while demonstrating the strategic limitations that would ultimately constrain Almoravid's success in Iberia. The scattered remnants of Alfonso's army were unable to offer coordinated resistance to Almoravid advances. However, Yusuf ibn Tashfin's decision to return to Morocco rather than pressing his advantage toward Toledo reflected the logistical difficulties of maintaining large armies across the strait for extended periods. The victory had been won, but it had not been exploited. The temporary unification of Al-Andalus under Almoravid authority proceeded systematically as North African forces returned to the peninsula in subsequent campaigns. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's strategy involved the gradual elimination of Taifa independence through a combination of military pressure and religious legitimation. Taifa rulers who resisted incorporation into the Almoravid state were denounced as corrupt innovators whose religious practices had been contaminated by excessive contact with Christian influences. One by one, the Taifa kingdoms fell, not to Christian conquest, but to their supposed saviors. The conquest of Seville in 1091 marked a crucial stage in this process of reunification. The Abadid rulers of Seville had been among the most sophisticated and culturally accomplished of the Taifa dynasties, maintaining a court that rivaled Córdoba in its patronage of poetry, music, and architectural projects. However, their military resources proved inadequate to resist Almoravid's siege techniques, while their religious practices were condemned by North African clerics as corrupted by un-Islamic innovations. The last Abadid king, Al-Mutamid, was sent into exile in Morocco, where he died in poverty, a poet king destroyed by Puritans who despised everything he represented. The emergence of the Almohad movement in the Atlas Mountains during the 1120s represented a new phase of North African religious reform that would eventually challenge Almoravid authority throughout the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. The Almohads, whose name derived from Al-Muwahidun, those who proclaimed the unity of God, originated as followers of Ibn Tumart, a Berber religious scholar who had studied in the Eastern Islamic world before returning to Morocco with a message of theological and social reform. Ibn Tumart's religious teachings emphasized the absolute unity and transcendence of God in ways that directly challenged Almoravid theological positions. The Almohad founder condemned what he considered the anthropomorphic tendencies in Almoravid religious practice, while his social program called for the elimination of tribal distinctions in favor of a unified Islamic community based purely on religious devotion. The Almohad conquest of Almoravid territories proceeded systematically through a series of campaigns that demonstrated superior military organization and strategic planning. The capture of Marrakesh in 1147 eliminated the center of Almoravid power in North Africa, while subsequent operations extended Almohad control eastward toward Tunisia and westward toward the Atlantic. The Almohad invasion of Al-Andalus began in 1146 with limited reconnaissance operations designed to test the strength of Almoravid defenses and evaluate the potential for local support. The systematic conquest of Almoravid territories in southern Iberia proceeded rapidly once the Almohad commander committed substantial forces to the peninsula. The architectural achievements of the Almohad period represented the culmination of Western Islamic building traditions, while introducing innovations that would influence construction throughout the Mediterranean world. The construction of the Giralda Tower in Seville, begun around 1184, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized Almohad building programs. The tower's massive square base supported a minaret that rose to unprecedented heights, creating a landmark visible throughout the Guadalquivir Valley. The building's decorative program combined traditional Islamic geometric patterns with innovations in brick and tile work that created distinctively Almohad visual effects. But the Almohads faced the same fundamental problem that had confronted every Islamic power in Iberia. The Christian kingdoms to the north were growing stronger, more organized, and more determined. The fragmented Taifa period had given the Christians time to consolidate their gains and develop new military techniques. The Almoravids had won a great victory at Sagrajas, but had failed to follow it up. Now the Almohads would face the consequences. The catastrophic defeat of Almohad forces at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 shattered the last unified Islamic resistance to Christian expansion in the peninsula. The battle had been years in the making. As Pope Innocent III proclaimed a crusade against the Almohads, and Christian rulers from across Iberia and beyond assembled the largest army the peninsula had ever seen. Alfonso VIII of Castile, who had suffered a devastating defeat at Almohad hands at Alarcos in 1195, had spent 17 years preparing for revenge. He had rebuilt his army, strengthened his fortifications, and forged alliances with the other Christian kingdoms. When the crusading army finally assembled at Toledo in the summer of 1212, it included forces from Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, and volunteers from France and other parts of Europe. The Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, had assembled an equally impressive force, drawing troops from throughout North Africa and Al-Andalus. Contemporary sources describe both armies as numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians estimate more modest figures of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 on each side. The battle took place on July 16, 1212, in a mountain pass in the Sierra Morena. The terrain favored the defenders, and the Almohad position seemed nearly impregnable. But a local shepherd, or so the legend goes, showed the Christian forces a hidden path that allowed them to outflank the Almohad defenses. The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa had shattered the myth of Islamic invincibility. For 5 centuries, Muslim armies had dominated the peninsula, their military prowess seemingly unmatched. Now that illusion lay broken on the slopes of Sierra Morena, and Christian kings understood that the great cities of Al-Andalus, cities that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, could fall. But understanding opportunity and seizing it are different things entirely. The decades following Las Navas saw the Christian kingdoms consumed by internal conflicts, succession disputes, and the eternal struggle between royal authority and noble privilege. The Almohad Caliphate, though wounded, still controlled the richest and most populous regions of the peninsula. The great conquest would require not just military strength, but political genius. That genius arrived in the person of Fernando III of Castile, a king who combined his grandfather Alfonso VIII's military brilliance with a diplomatic sophistication that his predecessors had lacked. Fernando understood that conquering Al-Andalus required more than winning battles. It required managing the complex politics of a multi-religious society while maintaining the unity of his own fractious kingdom. Fernando's first great achievement came not through war, but through inheritance. In 1230, his father Alfonso IX of Leon died, and Fernando united the crowns of Castile and Leon permanently. This union, which previous attempts had failed to maintain, created a kingdom with the resources and manpower to undertake sustained offensive operations against Al-Andalus. The king moved methodically, understanding that the Almohad collapse had created a new Taifa period. Dozens of small Muslim kingdoms, each desperate for survival, each potentially willing to become a tributary rather than face destruction. Fernando exploited these divisions with cold precision, accepting tribute from some rulers while crushing others, always keeping his enemies divided and uncertain. Cordoba fell in 1236. and the conquest of this city carried symbolic weight that transcended its strategic importance. For over 5 centuries, Córdoba had been the heart of Islamic Iberia, first as the capital of the Umayyad Emirate, then as the seat of the Caliphate, always as the cultural and intellectual center of Al-Andalus. The Great Mosque, with its forest of columns and its revolutionary architecture, had proclaimed Islamic civilization's superiority for generations. When Fernando's forces entered the city, they found a population that had already largely fled. The Córdoba of Abd al-Rahman III, the city of 1 million inhabitants, had long since declined, but the symbolism remained overwhelming. Fernando ordered the bells of Santiago de Compostela, carried to Córdoba as trophies by Al-Mansur in 997, returned to their original home, carried on the shoulders of Muslim prisoners. The humiliation of 2 centuries earlier was finally avenged. The Great Mosque became a cathedral, though Fernando, displaying the pragmatism that characterized his reign, preserved much of its structure. The forest of columns remained, the horseshoe arches continued to frame the space, but now they surrounded Christian altars. This transformation, Islamic sacred space converted to Christian use, would be repeated across the conquered territories, creating the unique architectural heritage that still defines southern Spain. Jain fell in 1246, after a prolonged siege, its ruler Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr accepting vassalage to Castile in exchange for his life and a small kingdom around Granada. This decision, born of desperation, would have consequences that lasted 2.5 centuries. The Nasrid dynasty that Muhammad founded would rule Granada until 1492, the last Muslim state in Iberia, surviving through a combination of tributary payments, diplomatic skill, and the mountainous terrain that made their kingdom difficult to conquer. But the greatest prize remained: Seville. The city had served as the Almohad capital in Iberia, and it remained the largest and wealthiest urban center in the peninsula. Its conquest would effectively end Islamic power in Iberia, reducing the Muslims to the mountainous enclave of Granada. The siege of Seville began in 1247 and lasted over a year. Fernando assembled the largest Christian army ever seen in the peninsula, supplemented by a fleet that blockaded the Guadalquivir River. The city's defenses were formidable, walls that had been strengthened over centuries, a population still large enough to man them, and the river that had always provided access to supplies and reinforcements. Fernando's masterstroke was the naval blockade. He recruited sailors from the Cantabrian coast, men experienced in Atlantic waters, and tasked them with closing the Guadalquivir. When they succeeded in breaking the bridge of boats that connected Seville to Triana, the city's fate was sealed. Cut off from resupply, the defenders could only watch as their provisions dwindled. Seville surrendered in November 1248. Unlike Córdoba, the city's population was expelled. Fernando wanted Seville as a Christian city, repopulated with settlers from the north. The Great Mosque became a cathedral, though it would later be demolished to make way for the massive Gothic structure that still dominates the city's skyline. The Alcazar, the Almohad Palace, became a royal residence, its Islamic architecture preserved and later expanded by Christian kings who appreciated its beauty. The conquest of Seville transformed the demographic and economic geography of Iberia. Suddenly, Castile controlled the Guadalquivir Valley, one of the most fertile agricultural regions in Europe. The kingdom gained access to Atlantic trade routes, positioning it for the maritime expansion that would eventually lead to the Americas. The Muslim population of the conquered territories faced a choice: conversion, emigration, or life as a subject minority under Christian rule. Fernando III died in 1252, his life's work complete. He had more than doubled the territory of Castile, conquered the 2 greatest cities of Al-Andalus, and reduced Islamic Iberia to a single tributary kingdom. The Church would later canonize him as Saint Ferdinand, the warrior king who had recovered the ancient Visigothic heartland for Christendom. While Castile expanded southward across the Meseta and into Andalusia, a different kind of power was emerging in the eastern peninsula. The Crown of Aragon, born from the union of the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona in 1137, would build something unprecedented in medieval Iberia, a Mediterranean commercial empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to Athens. This union itself was remarkable. Aragon was a landlocked mountain kingdom, its nobility proud and its traditions rooted in the Pyrenean valleys where the Reconquista had begun. Barcelona was a Mediterranean trading city, its merchants already connected to the commercial networks that linked Italy, North Africa, and the Levant. The marriage of these two entities created a hybrid state that combined feudal military power with mercantile capitalism. The architect of Aragonese Mediterranean expansion was Jaume I, known as the Conqueror, who reigned from 1213 to 1276. Jaume inherited a kingdom still recovering from the disaster of Muret, where his father had died fighting the Albigensian Crusade. The young king faced rebellious nobles, uncertain borders, and the challenge of proving himself worthy of his predecessors. Jaume's response was conquest on a scale that transformed the crown of Aragon. In 1229, he launched an amphibious assault on Majorca, the largest of the Balearic Islands. The island had served as a base for Muslim pirates who preyed on Christian shipping, and its conquest would secure Catalan trade routes while providing a stepping stone for further expansion. The Mallorcan campaign demonstrated the military capabilities that would characterize Aragonese expansion. Jaume assembled a fleet of over 150 ships, carrying perhaps 15,000 men, an enormous force for the period. The landing was opposed, the subsequent campaign brutal, but within months the island was conquered. The Muslim population faced the usual choice: conversion, slavery, or death. Most chose death or slavery. The island was repopulated with Catalans, who transformed it into a prosperous trading colony. Minorca and Ibiza followed, completing Aragonese control of the Balearics. But Jaume's greatest conquest lay on the mainland, Valencia, the rich coastal kingdom that Muslim rulers had held for over 5 centuries. The conquest of Valencia, completed between 1232 and 1245, added a territory larger than Aragon itself to the crown. Unlike the Balearics, Valencia had a substantial Muslim population that Jaume chose to preserve rather than expel. The reasons were practical. Valencia's agricultural wealth depended on sophisticated irrigation systems that only the Muslim population knew how to maintain. Expelling them would have meant economic catastrophe. This decision created a unique social structure. Valencia became a kingdom with 3 distinct populations: a Christian ruling class concentrated in the cities, a Muslim peasantry working the irrigated lands, and a Jewish community managing much of the commerce. This arrangement would persist for centuries, creating both prosperity and tension. Jaume I divided his realms between his sons, a decision that temporarily separated Majorca from the rest of the crown. But the logic of Mediterranean expansion proved irresistible, and within a century, the Balearics were reintegrated. More importantly, Jaume's conquests had established the Crown of Aragon as a major Mediterranean power, with the naval capacity and commercial networks to project influence far beyond Iberia. The next phase of expansion came under Pierre III, who in 1282 accepted the crown of Sicily after the uprising known as the Sicilian Vespers expelled the French Angevin dynasty. This acquisition was transformative. Sicily controlled the central Mediterranean, its position allowing whoever held it to dominate trade between East and West. The island's wheat exports fed the growing cities of Italy, while its strategic location made it invaluable for any power with Mediterranean ambitions. The Sicilian adventure embroiled Aragon in decades of conflict with France, the papacy, and the Angevin claimants to the island. But the Catalans proved remarkably successful at defending their conquest, their naval superiority allowing them to defeat larger enemies repeatedly. The war produced military innovations, the Almogavers, light infantry who became legendary for their ferocity, and commercial opportunities that enriched Barcelona's merchant class. By the early 14th century, the Crown of Aragon had become something unique in medieval Europe, a confederation of kingdoms united by a common dynasty, but maintaining separate laws, institutions, and identities. Aragon proper remained a landlocked kingdom of proud nobles and limited resources. Catalonia was a commercial powerhouse, its merchants trading throughout the Mediterranean. Valencia was an agricultural paradise with a complex multi-religious society. Majorca was a trading colony. Sicily was a strategic prize that connected the crown to Italian politics. The Catalan commercial network reached extraordinary extent. Catalan merchants established permanent colonies in North Africa, trading with Muslim rulers despite papal prohibitions. They competed with Genoa and Venice for the lucrative Eastern trade, establishing presences in Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Crusader states. Catalan cloth, Valencian ceramics, and Majorcan salt moved east. Spices, silk, and slaves moved west. The most remarkable episode of Catalan expansion came in the early 14th century, when a mercenary company of Almogavers, unemployed after the Sicilian Wars, hired themselves to the Byzantine emperor. The Catalan Company, as it became known, was supposed to fight the Turks threatening Constantinople. Instead, after their leader was murdered by Byzantine rivals, they turned on their employers, ravaging Thrace and Macedonia before conquering the Duchy of Athens in 1311. For over 7 decades, Catalans ruled Athens, the symbolic heart of classical civilization. Catalan became an official language in the shadow of the Acropolis. The Parthenon served as a Catholic cathedral. This bizarre episode, Mediterranean mercenaries ruling the city of Socrates and Plato, illustrated both the reach of Catalan commercial military expansion and its opportunistic, almost accidental character. The great conquests of Fernando III had given Castile enormous territories, but territory alone does not create wealth. The challenge facing his successors was transforming military conquest into economic prosperity, turning the vast empty spaces of the Meseta and the depopulated valleys of Andalusia into productive landscapes. The answer came in the form of sheep, millions of them, moving across the peninsula in annual migrations that shaped Castilian society, economy, and landscape for centuries. The wool trade would make Castile rich, but it would also create social structures and economic dependencies that influenced Spanish history long after the last flock had dispersed. Sheep had always been important in Iberia. The peninsula's climate, wet winters and dry summers, made transhumance, the seasonal movement of flocks between highland and lowland pastures, an obvious strategy. But the Reconquista transformed sheep farming from a local activity into a continental industry. The conquest of Andalusia and Extremadura opened vast new pastures for winter grazing. The Meseta, too sparsely populated for intensive agriculture, proved ideal for sheep. And the breed that would make Castilian fortunes, the Merino, produced wool of extraordinary quality, finer and softer than any competitor. The origins of the Merino remain disputed, but by the 13th century, Castilian flocks were producing wool that commanded premium prices in the textile centers of Flanders and Italy. Alfonso X, Fernando III's son and successor, recognized the economic potential and in 1273 organized the sheep owners into a royally chartered corporation, the Mesta. This organization, formerly known as the Honrado Consejo de la Mesta, would become one of the most powerful economic institutions in European history. The Mesta received extraordinary privileges. Its members could move their flocks across the kingdom on designated routes called Canadas, with rights to graze on common lands along the way. Local authorities were forbidden from obstructing the migrations or imposing unauthorized tolls. Disputes between shepherds and farmers were adjudicated by Mesta judges, who consistently favored pastoral over agricultural interests. The scale of the operation was staggering. By the late medieval period, perhaps 3 million sheep made the annual migration, moving from summer pastures in the mountains of Leon and Castile to winter grazing in Extremadura and Andalusia. The Canadas stretched for hundreds of kilometers, strips of land up to 90 meters wide that cut across the peninsula like arteries carrying woolly blood. The wool trade enriched Castile, but also shaped its social structure in distinctive ways. The great sheep owners were nobles and military orders, institutions with the capital to maintain enormous flocks and the political power to protect their privileges. The actual work of herding fell to hired shepherds, men who spent their lives moving with the flocks, developing a distinct subculture with its own traditions, songs, and social organization. The export trade concentrated in the northern ports, particularly Burgos, which became the commercial capital of Castile. Burgos merchants organized the wool trade, arranging sales to Flemish buyers, providing credit to sheep owners, and managing the complex logistics of moving thousands of bales to the coast. The city's wealth funded magnificent Gothic architecture. The cathedral, begun in 1221, remains one of the finest in Europe, but the wool economy had costs that would become apparent over centuries. The Mesta's privileges discouraged agricultural development, as farmers found their crops trampled by migrating flocks and their complaints dismissed by courts that favored pastoral interests. The emphasis on raw wool exports meant that Castile never developed a significant textile industry of its own. The value-added processing happened in Flanders and Italy, enriching foreign manufacturers, while Castile remained a supplier of raw materials. The Black Death, which reached Iberia in 1348, paradoxically strengthened the wool economy. The plague killed perhaps a third of the peninsula's population, creating labor shortages that made extensive sheep farming even more attractive than intensive agriculture. Land that had supported farming communities reverted to pasture. The Mesta's flocks grew, even as the human population shrank. The prosperity of the wool trade and the territorial gains of the Reconquista had made Castile the dominant power in Iberia. But beneath this success lay tensions that would explode into civil war, conflicts over royal authority, noble privilege, and the very nature of kingship that would reshape Castilian politics for generations. The crisis centered on Pedro I, who inherited the throne in 1350 at age 15. Pedro faced challenges that would have tested any ruler: a kingdom still recovering from the Black Death, a nobility accustomed to exploiting royal weakness, and half-brothers born of his father's numerous affairs who represented potential rivals for power. Pedro's response was violence. He executed nobles who challenged his authority, murdered a former mistress who had become inconvenient, and earned the nickname the Cruel from his enemies, though his supporters called him the Just, arguing that his harshness was necessary to restore royal power after decades of noble encroachment. The king's most fateful decision was his treatment of his half-brother Enrique of Trastamara. Enrique was the illegitimate son of Alfonso XI by his mistress Leonor de Guzman, and he had grown up at court, accumulating followers among nobles who resented Pedro's autocratic style. When Pedro executed Leonor and began eliminating potential rivals, Enrique fled to France, where he found allies eager to fish in Castile's troubled waters. The resulting civil war lasted over a decade and drew in the major powers of Western Europe. France supported Enrique, seeing an opportunity to install a friendly king in Castile and gain an ally against England. England backed Pedro, hoping to maintain the traditional Castilian alliance and prevent French encirclement. The conflict became entangled with the 100 Years' War, as English and French armies fought on Iberian soil for Iberian stakes. The war's most dramatic episode came in 1367, when an English army led by Edward, the Black Prince, invaded Castile to restore Pedro to his throne. The Battle of Najera was a crushing English victory, demonstrating the superiority of the longbow tactics that had won Crécy and Poitiers. Enrique fled, his cause apparently lost, but Pedro squandered his victory. He failed to pay the English army, which withdrew in disgust, ravaged by disease and unpaid wages. Enrique returned with French support, and the war resumed with increased bitterness. The final confrontation came at Montiel in 1369, where Pedro's forces were defeated and the king himself captured. What happened next became legendary. Enrique and Pedro met in a tent, supposedly to negotiate. The meeting turned violent, accounts differ on who struck first, and Enrique killed his half-brother with his own hands. The act was shocking even by medieval standards. A king murdered by his own brother, royal blood spilled in what amounted to a brawl. The Trastamara dynasty that Enrique founded would rule Castile until 1504, when Isabella's death ended the direct line. But the manner of its founding, regicide, fratricide, foreign intervention, cast a long shadow. Enrique II owed his throne to French support and noble backing, debts that constrained royal authority for generations. The Mercedes Enriqueñas, the grants of land and privilege that Enrique distributed to his supporters, enriched the nobility at the crown's expense and created an aristocratic class whose power would challenge future kings. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Fernando of Aragon in 1469 was an act of political calculation that would reshape the world. Neither was yet a monarch. Isabella was heir presumptive to a throne held by her half-brother. Fernando was heir to his father's crown of Aragon. Their union was opposed by powerful interests in both kingdoms, and its success was far from certain. Isabella's path to the throne required her to overcome her half-brother Enrique IV, whose reign had been marked by noble rebellion and questions about the legitimacy of his daughter Juana. When Enrique died in 1474, Isabella immediately proclaimed herself queen, but she faced a civil war against supporters of Juana, backed by Portugal. The conflict lasted 5 years and was decided as much by diplomacy as by battle, but by 1479 Isabella's position was secure. That same year, Fernando inherited the crown of Aragon upon his father's death. The union of the two crowns was personal, not institutional. Castile and Aragon remained separate kingdoms with separate laws, separate cortes, separate currencies. But the combined resources of the two realms created a power that dominated the peninsula and could project influence across Europe and beyond. The Catholic monarchs, a title granted by Pope Alexander VI in 1494, pursued policies that would define Spain for centuries. Their first priority was establishing royal authority over the nobility that had grown so powerful during the civil wars. They revived the Santa Hermandad, a rural police force that suppressed noble banditry. They reformed the royal council, replacing noble grandees with university-trained lawyers loyal to the crown. They took control of the military orders, whose vast lands and revenues had made them states within the state. The conquest of Granada, completed in 1492 after a 10-year campaign, eliminated the last Muslim state in Iberia. The war was expensive and difficult. Granada's mountainous terrain favored the defenders, and the Nasrid kingdom fought with the desperation of a people facing extinction. But the Catholic monarchs mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale, deploying artillery that reduced fortress after fortress, maintaining armies in the field year after year until resistance collapsed. The fall of Granada on January 2, 1492, was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as the completion of a project that had begun nearly 8 centuries earlier. The Reconquista was finally complete. Isabella and Fernando entered the Alhambra in triumph, raising the cross over the palace that had been the last seat of Islamic power in Western Europe. But 1492 brought other transformations as well. In March, the Catholic monarchs issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews who refused baptism. The deadline was August 2, the same day that Christopher Columbus sailed from Palos on his voyage west. The coincidence was not accidental. Columbus's departure was delayed by the chaos of the expulsion, as Jewish refugees crowded the ports seeking passage to exile. The expulsion of the Jews ended a presence that had lasted over a millennium. Sephardic Jews had contributed enormously to Iberian culture, as physicians, philosophers, translators, merchants, and administrators. Their departure impoverished Spain intellectually and economically, though the full costs would only become apparent over generations. The expelled Jews scattered across the Mediterranean, carrying their language, Ladino, a form of medieval Spanish, to new homes in North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. Columbus's voyage, funded by Isabella after years of rejection by other courts, opened a new chapter in world history. The discovery of the Americas, a term that ignores the millions who already lived there, would transform Spain from a regional power into a global empire. The gold and silver of the New World would finance Spanish hegemony in Europe for over a century, while the conquest and colonization of the Americas would spread Spanish language, religion, and culture across half the Western Hemisphere. The Catholic monarchs also established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, an institution that would become synonymous with religious persecution. Unlike medieval inquisitions controlled by the papacy, the Spanish Inquisition was a royal institution, its inquisitors appointed by the crown, its revenues flowing to royal coffers. Its primary targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, though it later expanded to prosecute Protestants, blasphemers, and others deemed threats to religious orthodoxy. The Inquisition's methods, secret accusations, torture to extract confessions, public executions called autos da fe, created a climate of fear that shaped Spanish society for centuries. Its impact on intellectual life was profound. The Inquisition's index of prohibited books restricted access to ideas deemed dangerous, while the threat of prosecution discouraged the kind of free inquiry that was transforming Northern Europe. The Reconquista created institutions unlike anything else in medieval Europe, military orders that combined monastic discipline with martial prowess, organizations that were simultaneously religious communities and military forces, economic enterprises, and political powers. Understanding these orders is essential to understanding how the Christian kingdoms conquered and held the vast territories they took from Al-Andalus. The concept originated in the Holy Land, where the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller had demonstrated that monks could fight. The Iberian orders adapted this model to local conditions, creating organizations specifically designed for the permanent warfare of the Reconquista. The Order of Calatrava, founded in 1158, was the first major Iberian military order. Its origins lay in the defense of the fortress of Calatrava, which the Templars had abandoned as indefensible. A Cistercian abbot and a group of knights took up the challenge, And from this desperate defense grew an organization that would become one of the most powerful institutions in Castile. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, became the largest and wealthiest of the Iberian orders. Its knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But the order itself accumulated enormous wealth, lands granted by grateful kings, revenues from conquered territories, income from the thousands of peasants who worked order estates. By the 15th century, the Order of Santiago controlled perhaps a quarter of the territory of Castile. The Order of Alcántara, originally founded as the Order of San Julián de Porrero, guarded the western frontier against both Muslims and Portuguese. The Order of Montesa served similar functions in the Crown of Aragon, after the suppression of the Templars in 1312. These orders performed functions that medieval states could not. They maintained permanent garrisons in frontier fortresses, providing continuous defense rather than the seasonal campaigns that feudal levies could sustain. They organized the settlement of conquered territories, bringing in colonists, and establishing the agricultural infrastructure that made conquest permanent. They provided banking services, managing the complex finances of the Reconquista. The order's military contribution was substantial. A major campaign might include hundreds of order knights, each supported by squires and sergeants, forming the heavy cavalry that decided medieval battles. The orders maintained their own infantry, their own siege engineers, their own supply systems. They were, in effect, standing armies in an age when most military forces were temporary assemblages. But the orders were also economic enterprises of enormous scale. Their lands produced wheat, wine, olive oil, and above all, wool. The orders were among the largest members of the Mesta, their flocks numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They operated mills, collected tolls, administered justice on their territories. The Grand Master of Santiago was one of the richest men in Castile, his income rivaling that of the greatest nobles. This wealth made the order's political powers that kings could not ignore. The election of a new Grand Master was a matter of state concern, as the wrong choice could create a rival center of power. The order's knights came from noble families, creating networks of kinship and loyalty that crossed the boundaries between order and secular society. By the late medieval period, the orders had become as much obstacles to royal authority as instruments of it. The Catholic monarchs solved this problem by taking control of the orders themselves. Fernando became Grand Master of Santiago in 1476, of Calatrava in 1487, of Alcántara in 1494. These acquisitions, confirmed by papal bulls, gave the crown control of the order's vast revenues and eliminated potential centers of opposition. The orders continued to exist, but as instruments of royal policy rather than independent powers. No account of medieval Iberia can be complete without understanding the Jewish communities that contributed so much to its civilization and suffered so greatly in its conflicts. The Jews of Sepharad, the Hebrew name for Iberia, created a culture of extraordinary richness, produced scholars and poets whose works still resonate, and ultimately faced a catastrophe that scattered them across the world. Jews had lived in Iberia since Roman times, their communities predating the Christian kingdoms by centuries. Under Visigothic rule, they faced periodic persecution, but the Islamic conquest of 711 brought relief. Muslim rulers, following Quranic injunctions to protect people of the book, granted Jews dhimmi status, second class but protected, subject to special taxes but free to practice their religion and manage their own affairs. The result was a flowering of Jewish culture, unprecedented since ancient times. In Al-Andalus, Jews served as physicians, diplomats, and administrators. They translated Greek philosophy from Arabic into Latin, making Aristotle available to Christian Europe. They developed Hebrew poetry to new heights of sophistication, adapting Arabic meters and themes to create works of stunning beauty. The greatest figure of this golden age was Moses Maimonides. Born in Cordoba in 1138, Maimonides was a physician, philosopher, and legal scholar whose works shaped Jewish thought for centuries. His Guide for the Perplexed attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theology, while his codification of Jewish law remains authoritative today. Though he spent most of his adult life in Egypt, fleeing the Almohad persecution that ended the Andalusian Golden Age, Maimonides embodied the intellectual achievements that Iberian Jewish culture had made possible. The Christian conquest created new opportunities and new dangers. Christian kings valued Jewish skills as physicians, as financial administrators, as diplomats who could negotiate with Muslim rulers. Jews served in royal courts, managed royal revenues, and accumulated wealth that made them targets of popular resentment. The position of Jews in Christian Iberia was always precarious. Church doctrine held that Jews should be preserved as witnesses to Christian truth, their degraded condition demonstrating the consequences of rejecting Christ. But this theological protection coexisted with popular hostility, economic resentment, and periodic violence. The crisis came in 1391, when anti-Jewish riots swept across the peninsula. The violence began in Seville and spread to virtually every major city. Thousands of Jews were killed. Thousands more accepted baptism to save their lives. The riots destroyed communities that had existed for centuries and created a new social category, the conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but remained suspect in the eyes of their neighbors. The converso problem would poison Spanish society for generations. Many conversions had been forced or insincere, and some conversos continued to practice Judaism secretly. But others became sincere Christians, rising to prominence in the church, the government, and the professions. The question of who was a real Christian and who was a secret Judaizer became an obsession, leading to the establishment of the Inquisition and the development of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood statutes that discriminated against anyone of Jewish ancestry, no matter how distant. The expulsion of 1492 was the final act of this tragedy. Jews who refused baptism were given 4 months to leave, allowed to take their movable property but forbidden to export gold or silver. Perhaps 100,000 left, perhaps 50,000 converted and remained. The exiles scattered across the Mediterranean, carrying their language, their traditions, and their memories of Sepharad to new homes where their descendants live today. The story we have traced, from the collapse of Roman authority to the triumph of the Catholic monarchs, spans over 1,000 years and encompasses transformations so profound that the Iberia of 1492 would have been unrecognizable to the inhabitants of 409. The Germanic invasions that destroyed Roman Hispania created the conditions for the Visigothic kingdom, which in turn established patterns of law, religion, and political organization that would persist through all subsequent changes. The Islamic conquest of 711 brought Iberia into a new civilizational orbit, creating Al-Andalus, a society that at its height represented the most advanced culture in Western Europe. The Reconquista, that centuries-long process of Christian expansion, was never the simple religious crusade that later mythology would make it. It was a complex phenomenon driven by demographic pressure, economic opportunity, and political ambition as much as by faith. The Christian kingdoms that emerged from this process, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Navarre, developed distinct identities and institutions that would shape their futures in different ways. The union of Castile and Aragon under the Catholic monarchs created something new. Not yet a unified Spain, but a dynastic partnership with the resources to complete the Reconquista, expel the Jews, establish the Inquisition, and launch the voyages that would create a global empire. The Spain that emerged from this process was shaped by its medieval experience, by the centuries of frontier warfare, by the coexistence and conflict of three religions, by the institutions and attitudes that the Reconquista had created. The consequences of this history extended far beyond Iberia. The conquistadors who conquered the Americas carried with them attitudes forged in the Reconquista, the expectation of land grants for military service, the assumption that conquered peoples should convert or suffer, the combination of religious zeal and material ambition that characterized the Iberian frontier. The Inquisition's methods spread to the colonies, while the expulsion of Jews and later Muslims impoverished Spain intellectually just as it was acquiring an empire that demanded administrative sophistication. Understanding medieval Iberia is essential to understanding not just Spain and Portugal but Latin America, the Philippines, and the global spread of Iberian languages and cultures. The conflicts and accommodations of this period, between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, between royal authority and noble privilege, between local identity and larger political units, created patterns that would repeat, with variations, across the Iberian world. The Iberia of 1492 stood at a threshold. Behind lay a millennium of transformation. Ahead lay the creation of the first global empires. The medieval experience had forged the tools, military, administrative, ideological, that would make that expansion possible. But it had also created limitations and blind spots that would eventually contribute to imperial decline. This is the story of how a Roman province became a collection of medieval kingdoms, how those kingdoms conquered and absorbed an Islamic civilization, and how they finally united to create something new. It is a story of war and peace, of persecution and coexistence, of destruction and creation. It is, in short, the story of how Spain was made.